Greetings, Mark Patton here, and bringing you a message from the book of Joshua, chapter 6. Very familiar story, the story of the conquest of Jericho. And the main thought I want to get across to you today is this: God fights for his people in order to fulfill his promises. Let me ask you a question. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where you had received a promise or perhaps had a dream that seemed like it would never come to pass. Maybe when you were a child. I remember when I was growing up in the United States, my parents said, we're going to go to Disney World. It was such an exciting thing, and I remember it just seemed like forever before finally the trip came and we went to Disney World. Or maybe a dream that we had when my wife and I got married. We said one day we want to go to Israel and visit the promised land, and years and years passed, and it was actually our 25th anniversary when we finally were able to go to Israel on a trip. And thinking of all those years we waited for that. But you think about the nation of Israel here, and God had made a promise to Abraham hundreds of years earlier that he was going to give this land to Abraham's descendants. And they ended up in Egypt. 400 years passed there. They ended up in slavery. Hundreds of years passing, and the promise has not yet been fulfilled. And they finally come out of Egypt, and they make their way to the promised land, get right to the border. And then the parents of this generation turn back. And so some of these kids were not yet born, or some of these people weren't yet born, but others were teenagers probably at that time. And then once again, the promise was not fulfilled. So 40 years in the wilderness, and here they are once again, just stepping into the promised land. And so hundreds of years have passed, and the question is, will God now? Is he now going to fulfill this promise? And there's three principles I want us to see here. The first principle is that of how Satan resists God's people and God's plan and tries to prevent God's promises from being fulfilled. We begin Joshua 6 and reading verse 1. It says, "Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in." And so we see here the nation of Israel, which not even yet a nation, a people of Israel have arrived. They've crossed the Jordan. They can see Jericho, and they see these huge walls, this fortified city. And they don't have the equipment, they don't have the training. It seems like an impossible task. And the Bible emphasizes here, you see the opposition. It says Jericho was shut up inside and outside. No one's going in, no one's going out. And it's kind of the statement we see from the enemy, the opposition, saying, God, your promise will not be fulfilled. You can't come in here. I see this as kind of a picture of Satan and how sometimes he just says no. What God's promised, that's not going to happen. And that can be in our own personal lives. And sometimes we're faced with the city of Jericho in front of us. It just seems impossible. Maybe it's a family problem, maybe a financial problem, maybe a relationship problem, a problem at work or something like that. And humanly speaking, it just seems impossible. It's like Satan just puts up a big sign and says, no, this isn't going to happen. This may be something we face even as a church sometimes, and God gives a vision to the church or a promise, and we start out, and all of a sudden the opposition comes, and it's kind of like God puts up his hands and says, no. I remember when we were starting our first church in Esztergom, and we've been meeting in a public school, and we had this vision of a church that's going to grow and all this, and then all of a sudden the opposition came, and the principal of the school says, you can't come, you can't be here anymore. And we were like, why? What's going on? He says, well, up in the city hall, they don't want a Baptist church in town. And it's like we were shut out of all public buildings, and it was like, what are we going to do? And so sometimes you face that opposition. But remember the principle we're talking about. God fights for his people in order to fulfill his promises. So there's a second principle here, and it's that God is present and active in this battle. For this, I want us to step back to the previous chapter, chapter 5, and the end of chapter 5 says this: when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped him and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. So we're faced with this question: who is this man? It seems that it is God himself, God appearing in the flesh here. And Joshua says, "Are you with us or against us or for the enemy?" And the answer is no, really, it's neither. He said, "I'm the leader of the Lord's army." It's not a question of whether God is on my side, it's a question of whether I am on his side. But I love the statement he makes. He says, "Now I have come. Now I have come." And it's so like, here's the great walls of Jericho, this opposition, Satan saying, "No, you're not going to come in here." Oh, here we see God shows up and he says, "I have come. I am here." And I want us to see this, that God just doesn't send us into battle. So God comes and he says, "I am going into battle with you." And so this thought, God fights for his people. We could say God fights with his people in order to fulfill his promises. And then there's a third principle here. God calls us to join him in the battle. I know there's times where sometimes God says to his people, "You just stand, be still, and let me fight this battle." And there are times like that when it's like we just kind of step back and God steps in. But I would say that's not normally the case. Normally the case, I would say, God calls us to join him in the battle. We are going to participate in the fight. And so we see here, it says, God speaks to Joshua and says, go march around the city. All the fighting men go around the city once. Do this for 6 days. So for 6 days, every day, they go around the city one time. And the 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram and horns before the ark. And on the 7th, they march around the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they blow a long blast with the ram's horn, all the people shall shout with a great shout. And the wall of the city shall fall down flat. And the people shall go up on it, every man in his place. So we see that God has a plan. So here, God's made a promise, and then we move toward the promise, and we face this opposition. But then God steps in and says, "I'm here, don't worry. And I have a plan. I have a plan." And he reveals that plan. Let me say this, oftentimes God's plan just is going to demand faith from us. God's plan to, you're going to march around the city, blow some trumpets and shout, and you're going to win this battle. I mean, that's something that's going to take faith, because that's not the way battles are typically won. We also see God's plan often requires perseverance, so they're going to go around the city once each day, and they go around once, nothing happens. They go around the next day, nothing happens. The third day, nothing happens. The fourth day, nothing happens. And we see that they just go back and obey, go back in faith and persevere. And even on that 7th day, they go around once, nothing, twice, nothing. They just got to keep going and being faithful in obedience before the victory comes. We also see that we have to fight together. We see the whole nation kind of is involved in this whole thing, marching around the city. All the people are going to shout, and so God brings everybody together as to have some part in this. Probably all didn't march in there, certainly not the women and children, but they're somehow all a part of it. And I see even that as a message, how as we step into the battle with God, to see his promises fulfilled, you need to be a part of the people of God. So many people, I think, are just kind of fighting on their own, or if they've abandoned church, they're trying to do things their own way without the support of other people. And here we see it's God's people working together. We see the presence of God kind of represented in the as they carry the Ark of the Covenant around. And then to me, it's just kind of interesting to see. It says, all the people will shout, and when the people shout, the walls will fall down. When they blow the trumpets, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, all the people shall break into a loud shout, and then the walls come down. So if we can just picture these walls, at first we see these walls in opposition, Satan's opposition, that's what they're representing. And by the end of the story, we see the walls have crashed down, they've collapsed, showing God's total victory in the battle. And just an interesting thought, maybe we could even see prayer, how the walls fall down at the cry of God's people. As God's people lift up their voices together, those walls come crashing down. As applications go, I think we could apply this even personally to our own lives. When you see areas in your own lives where God perhaps has made a promise and you're moving toward that promise and the opposition comes, as we talked about, maybe financial, maybe health problems, maybe family problems, or different kinds of opposition, how we could just see here this principle once again that comes through the story. God fights for his people. Remember, God is present. God shows up. God is there. He's not abandoned you. He has a plan. And he calls you to join him in his plan and to trust him and obey. And you can see the victory. But we also can apply this to a church as it moves forward. And our church right now is considering a new church plan in 2026. In fact, later today, we're going to go on a prayer walk and walk around an area of the city that we're thinking about. Maybe that's where God wants us to plan. And to think about, as the church moves toward God's promises, how many times Satan stands up and says no. And as a church, we have to just trust God and say, God's with us. He's fighting for us. And he's calling us to join him in the battle. And some of that is prayer. And some of that is going forth in evangelism and faith. So my friends, as we wrap up the message, let me just quote that sentence one more time. God fights for his people in order to fulfill his promises. And I don't know what it is you're facing today as an individual, as a pastor, as a church. My call to you today is just to trust and realize God is there. God has a plan. And it's our job just to join that plan and follow him by faith to see the victory that he has for us. May the Lord bless you. Thank you.